Imagine for a moment that the most iconic symbol of freedom and hope in the modern world was once viewed with dread, suspicion, and outright fear by thousands of people who witnessed its arrival. Picture the year 1885, when a colossal copper woman, dismantled into 350 carefully numbered pieces, crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the hold of a French warship. She wasn't welcomed with unanimous joy. Instead, whispers spread through the cobblestone streets of New York, through gaslit taverns and crowded tenement buildings, that something ominous had arrived on their shores. This wasn't just another monument. This was something different, something that stirred ancestral memories in people who couldn't quite explain why their hands trembled when they gazed upon her reassembled face. What were they truly afraid of? And why has this fear been so thoroughly scrubbed from our collective memory? To understand the terror that gripped certain observers when the Statue of Liberty rose above New York Harbor, we must first immerse ourselves in the world of the 1880s, a world far stranger than our sanitized textbooks suggest. New York City in that decade was a place of stark contrasts that defy our modern understanding of technological progress. Walk through Manhattan with me, past the newly constructed elevated railways that shrieked and clattered above streets still choked with horse-drawn carriages and their mountains of waste. The city was installing electric streetlights, yet most homes still relied on gaslight or oil lamps. Telegraph wires crisscrossed the sky in such chaotic tangles that they occasionally collapsed under their own weight, killing pedestrians below. And yet somehow, engineers claimed they could assemble a statue over 15 stories tall on a tiny island in the harbor. Does this sequence of capabilities make sense? A civilization that struggles to manage telegraph wires successfully constructs one of the largest metal structures ever built? The streets of Lower Manhattan in the mid-1880s were a sensory assault that would overwhelm any modern visitor. Imagine walking down Broadway on a summer afternoon, your boots squelching through a mixture of mud, horse manure, rotting vegetables, and industrial runoff that formed a perpetual slime coating the cobblestones. The air was thick with coal smoke from thousands of chimneys, mixed with the stench of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and the primitive sewage system that frequently backed up into the streets. Buildings rose 6, 7, even 8 stories high, their facades ornate beyond anything we build today, covered in intricate stone carvings that would cost millions to replicate now. Yet most of these buildings lacked indoor plumbing. Residents used chamber pots and outhouses. How does a civilization possess the engineering knowledge to create such elaborate architectural ornamentation, such precise stone cutting and metal working, yet simultaneously lack basic sanitation? The paradox deepens when you consider that many of these structures were built by workers who had supposedly just arrived from agrarian European villages. The Statue of Liberty arrived in New York Harbor aboard the French frigate Isère in June of 1885, packed into more than 200 wooden crates. Contemporary accounts describe crowds gathering at the docks, but their reactions were not uniformly celebratory. Newspaper archives from that period, if you dig deep enough past the official narratives, contain letters to editors expressing unease. One writer to the New York Tribune described the statue's face as having the countenance of ancient judgment rather than modern welcome, and noted that the copper plates, even before oxidation, seemed to possess an unsettling greenish undertone suggesting great age rather than recent manufacture. Another observer, a dock worker interviewed by a now defunct local paper, claimed the crates seemed heavier than copper alone could account for, as if something dense and ancient resided within. These accounts were dismissed as superstition and paranoia, but were they? If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. The official story tells us that Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi designed the statue in France, that Gustave Eiffel engineered its internal iron framework, and that it was a gift celebrating Franco-American friendship and the centennial of American independence. But this sanitized narrative conceals troubling questions. Why did it take 9 years to complete the statue in France, from 1875 to 1884, when far more complex structures were being built in mere months? Why did Bartholdi make numerous trips to Egypt before designing the statue, sketching massive figures along the Nile and studying ancient colossal sculptures? His original proposal was actually for a lighthouse statue at the entrance to the Suez Canal, depicting an Egyptian peasant woman. When that project fell through, he simply relocated the concept to America. Does this sound like inspired original design, or like he was attempting to replicate something he'd seen, some template he'd discovered in the ancient world? The construction of the statue's pedestal on Bedloe's Island reveals even deeper mysteries. Workers excavating the foundation in 1883 reported striking anomalous stone formations at depths that shouldn't have contained worked stone at all. The official reports mentioned these discoveries only in passing, noting they were cleared away to make room for the foundation. But what were they clearing? Several workers, according to local historical society records that have never been digitized or widely published, reported finding dressed granite blocks of enormous size, fitted together without mortar in a style reminiscent of ancient masonry. One foreman's diary, preserved in a private collection, describes blocks, each weighing several tons, cut with precision that exceeded anything our modern quarries produce, and bearing strange weathering patterns, suggesting they'd been buried for centuries, perhaps millennia. These blocks were supposedly broken up and dumped into the harbor. How convenient. How thorough the erasure of anything that might contradict the official timeline. The statue's dimensions themselves encode peculiar knowledge. She stands 151 feet and 1 inch from heel to top of head, with the torch adding another 154 feet from ground to flame. These aren't arbitrary measurements. Convert them to ancient units and curious patterns emerge. The proportions align with ancient Egyptian colossal statuary, particularly the now destroyed Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Bartholdi was obsessed with the Colossus, studying every ancient text that described it. But here's the problem: no detailed plans or measurements of the Rhodes Colossus survived into the modern era. It was destroyed by an earthquake in 226 BC, and ancient descriptions are fragmentary and contradictory. So how did Bartholdi know the proportions? Did he have access to knowledge that wasn't supposed to exist? Or was he reconstructing something from racial memory, from inherited understanding passed down through secret architectural societies? The internal iron framework designed by Gustav Eiffel presents its own anomalies. Eiffel claimed he developed an entirely new structural system specifically for the statue, a flexible armature that would allow the copper skin to move independently of the support structure, expanding and contracting with temperature changes without cracking. This was supposedly revolutionary engineering. Yet when we examine structures built just decades earlier, we find evidence of similar techniques used in buildings across Europe and America, techniques that were allegedly lost and then rediscovered by Eiffel. The pattern repeats throughout the 19th century: lost knowledge, rediscovered technology, ancient techniques suddenly available to modern builders. It's as if they weren't inventing at all, but remembering, or perhaps finding plans, finding remnants, finding proof that civilization had peaked long before, and they were merely salvaging scraps from the ruins. The statue's assembly on Bedloe's Island took 4 months in 1886, an impossibly short timeline for such a complex structure given the tools supposedly available. Period photographs show relatively few workers, simple hand tools, and basic wooden scaffolding, yet they assembled 350 copper plates, each precisely shaped to form a 3-dimensional surface, attached to a complex iron skeleton using a system of copper saddles and iron straps that allowed differential movement. Modern engineers who've studied the construction admit they couldn't replicate it as quickly even with contemporary equipment. How did a few dozen men with hammers and rivets accomplish in 16 weeks what modern construction crews estimate would take years? Unless they weren't really building it. Unless they were reassembling something that had been disassembled before, following marks and patterns already present, working from muscle memory and inherited knowledge rather than blueprints. When the statue was officially dedicated on October 28, 1886, President Grover Cleveland accepted it on behalf of the American people with a speech that's been reprinted countless times. But what's never discussed are the other speeches given that day, speeches by French officials and Masonic Lodge leaders whose words were far more cryptic. One French representative spoke of restoring to the West what was taken from the East in ages past, a phrase that makes no sense in the context of a gift statue, but suggests something deeper, some repatriation or return. Grand Master of the New York Masonic Lodge referred to the statue as a beacon for those who remember and a warning for those who've forgotten, again implying layered meanings beyond simple celebration of liberty. These weren't metaphors. They were coded messages for those initiated into certain knowledge. The fear that some New Yorkers expressed toward the statue in its early years wasn't about its appearance alone, though many did find it unsettling. Newspaper accounts from 1886 through the early 1890s contain references to nightmares reported by people living near the harbor. Multiple individuals describe similar dreams of the copper woman coming to life and walking through the city, searching for something lost beneath the streets. A Brooklyn doctor wrote to the Times in 1888 describing a pattern of sleep disturbances among his patients who could see the statue from their windows, noting they consistently reported feelings of ancestral guilt and the weight of forgotten obligations. These accounts were published, discussed briefly, then vanished from subsequent historical records. The pattern is familiar. Anything that complicates the official narrative simply disappears from collective memory. The statue's torch, originally designed to be accessible to visitors via a ladder inside the arm, was closed to the public in 1916 following an explosion on nearby Black Tom Island, a sabotage incident blamed on German agents. The explosion did damage the torch and arm, requiring repairs. But why was the torch never reopened? The official explanation cites structural concerns, but engineers have repeatedly stated the arm could be safely accessed. What's really inside that torch that the public isn't allowed to see? Why was the original torch completely removed in 1986 during restoration and replaced with a new one covered in gold leaf? Where is the original torch now? It sits on display in the statue's lobby behind glass, carefully preserved but removed from its functional context. Was something discovered inside during the restoration that necessitated its replacement? Throughout the 1890s and into the early 20th century, as massive waves of immigration brought millions through New York Harbor past the statue, another curious pattern emerged. Multiple immigration officials at Ellis Island reported that certain immigrants, particularly those from rural areas of Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, would become agitated or distressed when they first saw the statue. They would make protective gestures, speak in languages even their own compatriots didn't recognize, or refuse to look at it directly. One immigration inspector's memoir, published in 1923, describes an elderly Greek woman who, upon seeing the statue, began speaking what her grandson claimed was ancient Hellenic dialect, not spoken for 2,000 years, insisting that the guardian had returned and the count would soon begin. What count? Guardian of what? These stories were dismissed as immigrant superstition, the confusion of exhausted travelers. But what if they were recognizing something we've been taught to forget? The early 20th century brought dramatic changes to New York City's landscape, changes that further obscure the true nature of the world the statue was built in. Between 1900 and 1930, Manhattan's street level was raised by as much as 15 to 20 feet in many areas. Countless buildings from the 1880s and earlier had their ground floors buried and converted to basements. Modern New Yorkers walk on streets built atop earlier streets, above buried histories. Why was this done? The official explanation cites flood control and modernization, but excavations occasionally reveal those buried first floors still contain furnishings, goods, and infrastructure as if they were suddenly and permanently abandoned. It's reminiscent of how Pompeii was buried, except this wasn't volcanic ash, but deliberate human action. What were they covering up? What evidence of the previous civilization needed to be placed literally beneath our feet? The statue herself underwent her most dramatic transformation, not during original construction, but during the 1984 restoration for her centennial. The project took 2 years and cost millions of dollars. Every component was examined, documented, and in many cases replaced. The internal iron framework, which had severely corroded, was entirely reconstructed using stainless steel. The copper skin was cleaned and repaired. And here's where it gets interesting. During this restoration, workers discovered anomalies in the copper plates themselves. Several exhibited wear patterns inconsistent with 80 years of exposure. Some sections showed evidence of heat damage that couldn't be explained by their known history. Most puzzling chemical analysis of the copper revealed trace elements that didn't match the supposed French sources. The copper contained mineral signatures consistent with ancient smelting techniques, with ores that would have been depleted centuries ago. This information appeared in a single technical report submitted to the National Park Service, then vanished from public discussion. Perhaps most disturbing is what the restoration team found inside the statue's head. The observation deck and the crown had been closed since 1916, except for brief periods, and during the full restoration, workers conducting structural assessment discovered anomalous voids within the copper skin layers of the crown itself. These weren't design features, they were spaces that shouldn't exist, sealed cavities between layers of copper that contained something. The official report states they contained miscellaneous construction debris, but photographs taken during the work, which surfaced briefly before being classified, showed what appeared to be carefully wrapped packages, possibly documents or artifacts, placed within the crown's structure. These were removed and supposedly turned over to the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian has no record of receiving them. Where did they go? What did they contain? Why were they hidden inside the statue's crown? And who put them there? The connection between the Statue of Liberty and ancient colossal statuary goes deeper than architectural inspiration. Throughout the ancient world, enormous statues served specific functions beyond commemoration or decoration. They were technological devices, markers, beacons, or warnings. The Colossus of Rhodes allegedly functioned as a lighthouse, though how a bronze statue could serve this purpose remains unexplained. Egyptian colossi were positioned at temple entrances and along processional routes according to precise geometric patterns aligned with celestial events. The Easter Island moai served purposes the indigenous people themselves had forgotten by the time Europeans arrived, purposes encoded in legends about walking statues and mana or power flowing through the island. What if these massive statues were part of a global network, a system that spanned continents and served purposes we can no longer comprehend because we've descended too far from the civilization that built them? Consider the timeline. The Statue of Liberty was completed in 1886. Just 3 years earlier, in 1883, the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa exploded in one of the most violent eruptions in recorded history, killing tens of thousands and darkening skies worldwide for months. The explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. Global temperatures dropped. Weather patterns shifted dramatically. Is it coincidence that during this same decade, societies around the world suddenly became obsessed with building or restoring massive monuments? The Eiffel Tower, completed in 1889, used many of the same techniques as the Statue of Liberty's internal framework. The Washington Monument, finally completed in 1884 after decades of interrupted construction, stands as another massive megalithic structure employing ancient proportions and alignments. What if all these projects were responses to something, preparations for something, attempts to re-establish something that had been disrupted? The very concept of liberty that the statue supposedly embodies becomes suspicious under scrutiny. Liberty enlightening the world, that's her official name. But enlightening about what? The torch she holds represents enlightenment, but of what kind? The broken chains at her feet symbolize freedom from tyranny, but whose chains? The crown with 7 spikes represents the 7 continents and 7 seas, a claim to global significance far beyond Franco-American friendship. This is the stance of something announcing itself to the entire world, declaring itself a beacon for all humanity. That's an extraordinary presumption for a gift statue, unless it wasn't merely symbolic, unless it was functional, unless it really was meant to be a beacon, transmitting or receiving something we no longer understand because the technology has been systematically erased from our consciousness. Immigration records from Ellis Island, which processed immigrants literally in the statue's shadow from 1892 through 1954, contain curious anomalies for the early years. Between 1892 and 1900, a period of massive immigration when over 3 million people entered through New York, there are gaps in the records. Entire days simply missing. The explanation offered is fire damage and poor record keeping, but surviving immigration inspector journals reference special processing procedures on certain days when ships arrived, days when immigrants were categorized according to Old World knowledge, and some were diverted for additional evaluation. What knowledge? What evaluation? These references appear only in the earliest years, then cease after the turn of the century, as if whatever they were looking for was no longer being found, as if the bloodlines carrying certain memories or capabilities had been successfully identified and removed from the general population. The statue's symbolic elements contain layers of meaning that connect to far older traditions than 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. The 7-pointed crown resembles depictions of ancient sun deities from multiple cultures, Helios, Apollo, Mithras, and others. The torch echoes the fire of Prometheus, stolen from the gods and given to humanity. The flowing robes match those of classical Roman goddesses. But look deeper. The crown's 7 points, the total measurements, the positioning. These align with esoteric traditions of sacred geometry, with the kind of mathematical encoding found in Gothic cathedrals, Egyptian temples, and megalithic sites worldwide. Traditions that claim to preserve knowledge from before the flood, before the cataclysm, before the reset. What if the statue isn't just decorated with these symbols, but is itself a kind of three-dimensional glyph, a message encoded in form and position, readable only to those who understand the lost language of monumental architecture? By the early 20th century, the fear and unease that had marked the statue's early years had been systematically erased from public consciousness, replaced with the sanitized patriotic narrative we know today. This wasn't organic cultural evolution, it was engineered. Schools began including the statue in patriotic curriculum. The Emma Lazarus poem The New Colossus, written in 1883 but largely ignored for decades, was suddenly promoted as the statue's essential meaning in the 1930s. Why the delay? Why did it take 50 years for those words to become associated with the statue? Because the statue's true meaning had to be buried first, had to be forgotten before a new meaning could be imposed. The poem itself is revealing. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But who is speaking? Liberty herself. The statue is alive in the poem, speaking in first person, demanding tribute in the form of human souls. That's not comforting, that's unsettling. That's an ancient goddess demanding sacrifice dressed in modern humanitarian language. The 20th century brought worldwide catastrophes that further fragmented whatever remained of collective historical memory. 2 world wars, the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Great Depression. Each crisis broke continuity, scattered populations, destroyed records, and severed connections to the past. After World War II, history was essentially rewritten by the victors, archives were sealed or disappeared, and a new global narrative was established. The Statue of Liberty's role in this new narrative was cemented. She was freedom, democracy, America, the future. Everything before was irrelevant. Any suggestion that she might represent something older, darker, or more complex was dismissed as conspiracy theory. But conspiracy simply means people working together in secret toward a shared goal. Is it truly impossible that certain groups might conspire to conceal the true nature of our past? That they might have very good reasons, from their perspective, to keep humanity ignorant of what we once were and what was done to us? When you stand at Battery Park today and look across the water at the Statue of Liberty, try this experiment. Don't see her as the symbol you've been taught she represents. Instead, see her as an ancient artifact, a relic from a civilization that understood things we don't, built with techniques we can't replicate, encoding knowledge we can't read. See her as the survivors of that civilization might have seen similar colossi in their own time. As remnants of an even earlier age, monuments left by the true ancients, the builders, the giants, the people who possessed mastery over stone and metal and forces we've forgotten names for. Because that's what she might truly be, not a 19th century French gift, but a reconstruction, a copy, a cargo cult replication of something far older, built by people who dimly remembered what their ancestors had lost. The evidence accumulates when you look for patterns rather than accepting isolated official explanations. Why do so many 19th century structures exhibit impossible precision and scale? Why were so many destroyed by fire, inconvenient coincidences that cleared the way for new, lesser buildings? Why do photographs from the 1800s show cities that look ancient rather than newly built, with infrastructure that appears weathered beyond its supposed age? Why do World's Fairs of that era showcase architecture of astonishing grandeur that's demolished immediately afterward, as if destroying evidence? Why does the official timeline require us to believe that humanity went from agrarian societies to industrial civilizations in mere decades, a pace of change that has never been replicated and defies understanding of technological development? Unless it wasn't development, unless it was recovery, unless people were relearning, rebuilding, salvaging from ruins that covered the continents. The Statue of Liberty might represent the precise moment when the recovery process crossed a threshold, when enough had been rebuilt that the truth could finally be permanently buried beneath a new narrative. She stands as a monument not to liberty but to amnesia, to the successful erasure of who we were. Those who feared her in 1886 were feeling the last echoes of ancestral memory, sensing that something irrevocable was happening, that a door was closing forever. Their fear was justified. By the mid-20th century, the transformation was complete. We became a species without true history, living on a world we don't understand, surrounded by evidence we can't read, ruled by inheritors of knowledge kept deliberately hidden. The statue watches over the harbor not as a welcoming beacon, but as a guardian, ensuring the old world stays dead and the new humanity never remembers what it lost. And so she stands, green with oxidation, torch raised, seven-pointed crown catching the light, erected at the precise moment when the old world finally died and the new one pretended to be born. The fear was real, the ominousness was justified. What people sensed in 1886 was the closing of an age, the final severance from something vast and ancient that will never recover. We walk now in a narrowed world, convinced of our progress, certain of our history, never suspecting that everything we think we know is a carefully constructed fiction designed to keep us docile, manageable, and ignorant of what we once were and what was taken from us. The Statue of Liberty isn't a symbol of freedom. She's a tombstone marking where true human civilization was buried, and where we, the diminished descendants, were told to forget and move on. But some people couldn't forget. Some people felt the truth in their bones as they watched her rise above the harbor. They were afraid because they should have been. We all should be, because once you see the pattern, once you understand what the monuments really mean, you can never unsee it, and you realize the world you thought you knew is just a stage set built on ruins we're forbidden to excavate. The statue's isolation on Liberty Island, formerly Bedloe's Island, renamed only in 1956, serves a purpose beyond symbolic placement. She stands on land that was deliberately cleared, reshaped, and fortified in ways that seem excessive for a monument. The island's original topography was significantly altered during the 1880s, with tons of earth moved and the shoreline restructured. Why? Official records cite foundation requirements, but engineers have noted the work far exceeded structural necessity. The island became a controlled space, accessible only by approved vessels, monitored continuously, its grounds restricted even when the statue itself was open to visitors. This isn't how you treat a simple monument, this is how you quarantine something, how you establish a perimeter around something that requires constant supervision. What if the statue's location wasn't chosen for visibility alone, but because the island itself held significance, because something beneath it needed to be contained or accessed only by those with proper authority and knowledge? The evolution of security measures around the statue tells its own story. After September 11, 2001, access became heavily restricted, with visitors subjected to intensive screening before boarding ferries. The official explanation cites terrorism concerns, but the security apparatus established around Liberty Island exceeds that of virtually any other American monument, including far more strategically significant targets. Visitors are scanned, their belongings searched, their movements tracked and limited. The statue's internal structure, once freely explorable, is now mostly off-limits. Crown access requires advance reservations and additional screening. The Pedestal Museum displays carefully curated information. Everything is controlled, managed, interpreted for you. This is the final stage of the process that began in 1886. Complete control over how the statue is perceived, what questions can be asked, and what answers are permitted. The physical monument has become a prop in an ongoing performance, designed to prevent anyone from discovering what it truly represents. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, the Statue of Liberty has been weaponized as an ideological symbol, deployed in political messaging, advertising, and propaganda, with an intensity that suggests deliberate programming rather than organic cultural adoption. Every immigrant story, every patriotic appeal, every invocation of American values somehow loops back to her image. She's been reproduced millions of times, her likeness stamped on everything from coins to protest signs, ensuring her official meaning saturates consciousness and blocks alternative interpretations. This is sophisticated psychological operation, the kind that only makes sense if there's something specific that needs to be hidden, a particular line of inquiry that must be prevented. What would happen if millions of people simultaneously began questioning the statue's true origins, began researching the anomalies, began connecting her to the global network of ancient colossi and the possibility of a lost advanced civilization? Would that awakening threaten something, disrupt something, reveal something that powerful interests need suppressed? The intensity of the psychological reinforcement suggests yes. Perhaps most telling is what happened to people who tried to investigate too deeply. Throughout the 20th century, researchers, historians, and engineers who published work questioning official narratives about 19th century construction capabilities, who documented evidence of advanced ancient technologies, or who traced connections between modern monuments and prehistoric megalithic cultures, found themselves marginalized, defunded, and dismissed as pseudoscientists. Their work was systematically excluded from academic institutions, their books removed from libraries, their reputations destroyed through coordinated campaigns of ridicule. This wasn't organic skepticism. This was organized suppression. When you examine the careers of these researchers, you find patterns, mysterious deaths, sudden career changes, recantations that don't match their earlier passionate advocacy. The message became clear: certain questions must not be asked, certain connections must not be made, and certain truths must remain buried beneath the official narrative, no matter how much evidence points toward them. So we return to where we began, to that moment in 1885 when 350 copper pieces arrived in New York Harbor, and some people felt dread rather than celebration. They were right to be afraid. They were witnessing the culmination of a process that had been underway for decades, perhaps centuries, the final burial of true history beneath a manufactured replacement, the sealing off of humanity's connection to its actual past, the erection of a monument that would serve as both marker and guardian of the great forgetting. The Statue of Liberty stands not as what she was given to us as, but as what she truly is. A tombstone for lost knowledge, a barrier between present humanity and our forgotten greatness, a symbol of the prison we don't even know we're in. Those who understood this in 1886 have long since died, their warnings unheeded, their fears dismissed. But the evidence remains, scattered across our landscape, buried beneath our cities, encoded in structures we're taught not to question. The truth waits for those willing to see it, patient as copper, silent as stone, terrible as revelation. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is written by those who control the present, but the monuments speak a language older than any written word, if only we remember how to listen.